Ladies and gentlemen, everybody, all our viewers, all our participants, a very good morning, and thank you very much for joining us this morning to touch on a very important topic. And I hope we will have a very constructive and interactive session, and you will put your questions whether in the chat, and we will try our best to answer them all. I think the topic that we have put on the table today is a very important topic, and I'm very delighted at this collaboration between Emirates Environmental Group and Farnek. Farnek has been a very active member of EEG since they have joined in the early 2000s, and we are very delighted to continue building on this relationship to move forward for the benefit of all of us. The topic of net zero is a very important topic. It's the topic of the day. It's the current issue that is all over the world, and its manifestation is in different forms and different ways. So we wanted to put some explanation of this, simple action and suggestions that entities can take it on board and implement it. And many will be asking, why do we need, to take action for climate change? And how can we transform our organizations to achieve net zero? And what is net zero? So there will be a lot of these type of questions, and inshallah, our two speakers will be able to address all your queries and all your concerns. But let me give a brief intro of this topic. It is becoming more and more apparent that climate change is a growing threat to life on Earth as the way we know it, a force from which no species on this planet can be immune to. It will have, and it is having, a very negative impact on the majority, if not all, life on the planet. And we are seeing it on a daily basis nowadays in different parts of the world. When we say climate change, some people will say, that it is a natural phenomena. Yes, it is true that climate change is a natural phenomena, but the simple fact that we are seeing now, especially in the last 200 years, and the research that is showing us, is that human beings are behind this extraordinary change in the climate. And the main culprit in the process is fossil fuels. And those entities, or those who is in the society responsible for the biggest emissions of the greenhouse gases that are coming out of burning fossil fuels. Fingers point to corporations and to industries and to factories. As entities, multinational, grow their business using fossil fuels to power their machines, to power their operations and devices, it is becoming more and more apparent that these entities are, really being responsible for what we are seeing, a change in climatic conditions. And it's accelerating the emissions of greenhouse gases. Somebody will say that, majority of these emissions are coming from the energy sector. But where we see energy is going into everything that we need to run our lives, so it is part of the equation. Some of the research shows you that on an average, more than 24% of energy produced goes into industries. 40% of the road emissions are from transportation that belongs to commercial vehicles. Majority of the passenger vehicles on the road are for commercial purposes and for industries. So in reality, really, they are all intertwined. And the question that asks itself is, how can we then, as members of the society, as industries, come together to address these issues? Research is showing us again that 6% of the energy use is in the construction sector is in the commercial buildings. and 5% is used directly in industrial processes. If we are to take all these data and analyze them, you can see that companies and industries play a part directly or indirectly in historic and in the current greenhouse gases that we are seeing. The greenhouse gases comes as well not only from the energy consumption, from the land use, from the protection facilities, from the transportation of the goods and all that. And this is roughly estimated to be 40 to 50% of the emissions from companies in their operations, in their daily processes. Whether it is happening directly or it's happening through their supply chain indirectly or through their other stakeholders. But who is it affecting? It is unfortunately affecting the poorest people on this planet. It is them who are suffering, and it is them who are least involved in producing these emissions in the first place. But they are at the receiving end, and they are getting the impact, the highest impact of it. If we understand this impact, and if we are transparent and we are honest and we are running our operations in a responsible manner, then we are bound to take the nice and corrective and responsible steps to rectify these issues in our daily lives and in our daily operations, and to put the right type of strategies that is required to enable us really to be monitoring, to understand what are our emissions, and to be monitoring them, and to be putting in place rectifying solutions that will help us really in addressing this very important and very critical issue. I think we need to ask ourselves, it's not an easy thing, it's not something that will happen overnight, but it definitely requires us to take the actions and to take the actions now. We need to understand, do we have the right financial resources? Have we allocated the budgets that we needed to ensure that we are embarking on a sustainable journey? We need to look at the scenario in our countries. Is the government providing any incentives? Is there any encouraging platform that will motivate the private sector to take that route? How can we work on nullifying our emissions? What kind of capacity building do we need to have in place? How do we build our human capital? How do we train them? What kind of trainings do we need to give them? Do we have the capacity on the ground in the country or in our regions to ensure that we are benefiting from this type of training? What about recycling solutions? Is it part and parcel of our strategy? Is it part of the way that we are running organization? Are we slowly shifting our energy requirement from the traditional way of burning fossil fuels, or are we moving towards green grid? All these things we need to ensure that we have them in place. We need to look critically what are the environmental strategy that we have in place, what is the CSR strategy that we have in place, and what are the resources that are required to implement those. Are we going to invest? Because it does require investment in the initial stages. Are we going to invest for the long term? What is our short term? What is our medium term? What is a long-term strategy that we're ensuring to enable us to move steadily, slowly, but steadily in the right direction? How are we engaging our other stakeholders? Are we involving our suppliers? Are they with us in this journey, or we are singing solo? What about nature? There are a lot of, there's a strong call today from the UN to say that we need to look at nature-based solution. What does that really mean in tangible terms, in the language that corporations understand it? Are we going to be part of that solution? What about our future generation? When they finish schools and they enter universities, are we preparing them to be fit to enter into the workforce? Are we providing them with the necessary tools that they will require to make them an effective part of the society when they enter the workforce and they really help in this transformation? What kind of standards and practices that we need to have in place for all? What type of qualifications, regulations, legislation that we need to have in the country? What role can we play as individuals, as organizations, to ensure that the laws that are enacted are really practical, implementable, and can take us to achieve this goal of net zero? So to answer all these questions, and I'm sure there are so many more questions amongst our audience and attendees, that's why we have gathered today, and it really gives me great pleasure to invite our two speakers who will be sharing us the information and will be able to answer some of the questions that are in our minds and address more. So I would like to start by introducing Muna Nahdi. Muna, mashallah, is an award-winning sustainability expert. She has more than 15 years of experience in energy and in decarbonization. And again, this is an issue that I would like to underline it, because this is an essential part of what we are talking about. Through her very active experience and strong experience and thought leadership, Muna has been assisting organizations to become real players in the field of sustainable development. She is currently the head of sustainability at Farnek, and she is offering net zero consultancy and turnkey solutions. And after Muna will be Piyush Harwani. Piyush is an engineer, is an experienced engineer with more than 7 years plus experience and expertise in these areas of energy services, CEMs, CAP. He guides companies on how to achieve net zero goals, and proficient in carbon audits, putting proper strategies for net zero in organization, ESCO projects, and energy audits. So I will start with Muna. Muna, the floor is yours. Please take us through this wonderful journey.
Thank you so much, Ms. Habiba. It's also a pleasure for us to be here. I would like to thank you and your promptness as usual. The time we just gave the idea, or we discussed the idea, like, yes, we're ready. We need to actually, the market knowledge, we need to contribute, and let's do something together. I really appreciate the fact that Ms. Habiba is always looking to expand into partnerships that would actually lead to the market transformation and also sustainability. She doesn't look only at one certain area, or EEG doesn't only look at certain area. They are real believers in sustainability as a whole, and they always try to expand on the areas where they provide the knowledge and they enable the transformation. So thank you so much, Ms. Habiba. Thank you for the audience, the great audience who's with here us today. And I'm looking forward to be actually sharing my insights in the coming hour. And at the same time, I would like to keep this as engaging as possible, because it's really important that we learn from each other. One important factor that could lead to market transformation for net zero is the capacity building, as Ms. Habiba has mentioned. And we can only reach that capacity building if we look at economy collaborations and economy sharing, knowledge sharing throughout all the entities. And we try to help and share our experiences with a bit of an overview about net zero, carbon footprint, climate action opportunities and risk. We'll also be explaining a few of the decarbonization strategies, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Piyush, who will be sharing our Farnek net zero story, the journey that we've embarked on, and also the lessons that we've learned and the achievements that we're proud of today. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope everyone is excited. So from 1 to 5, I like to keep it very engaging, so we'll use the chat room a lot. So from 1 to 5, who's excited to begin this webinar? So can you please write down in the chat from 1 to 5, depending on your excitement level. So 1 if you're not that excited, and then 5 if you're very excited. Okay, very good. David, thank you for mentioning 5. Really appreciate it. That gives us a lot of actually, a lot of feedback and input to also be excited. Okay, great. So let's begin. So I think Ms. Habiba had already explained about my background and what I've done so far. I would like also to take this opportunity to learn about our audience, and also to enable the audience to learn about each other. So if you could please share in the chat your name, function, and the organization that you're coming from, 1 word about you, and why are you here today? What do you want to learn, or what do you want to, because that helps a lot in also shaping the discussion. So I know if I should go through so much details, little bit of details, just a high level. So if you can write down in the chat your name, function, organization, whatever information you can share with everyone would be great. 1 word about you and why you're here today. So do we have any initiation from anyone? Okay, Suzanne, head of CSR and communications at Mahzouz. Thank you so much for being the first one to introduce herself. So Mohammed Asif Wahid. So please just write down your names, your information on the chat, because that helps a lot in building the community. So everyone here can later on actually connect with each other, talk with each other. Maybe we can see also common interests. Okay. So I think, okay, we have, I'll give 2 minutes for introduction. So we have EHS manager, we have Nike, professor on circular economy, we have ESG director, Dave, looking for more ideas for carbon reduction plans. Very nice. Okay, and then 1 more minute, and then we can start moving forward towards sustainability. Okay, learn more on net zero and carbon footprints. Very nice. Okay. So actually, that's something that we have also thought about. What is really important to start with? We know that the level of understanding could vary from people. So we thought, let's start with the carbon footprint, because I think it's the most important thing. But before we start with the carbon footprint, I'm a strong believer on the why. And if you understand why you're doing something, then you will definitely have more commitment to doing it. So a lot of people talk about climate action. Why is it? So my question is climate change a risk or an opportunity? So if you think climate change is a risk, if you can mention why in the chat, or if you think it's an opportunity, if you can also mention in the chat. So is climate change a risk or an opportunity? From an individual level, from an organizational level, whatever level you represent, do you think climate change is a risk? I think it's both, Suzanne, okay? Suzanne thinks climate change, both, okay. The risk that's leading to opportunities to do better. Very nice. Well said, Sarah. Certainly both, all depending on the investments. Very nice. Okay, so I think most of our audience believe that climate risk is both a risk and opportunity. It's definitely both risk and opportunity. So if you look at climate change as a risk, cost of climate inaction as per the path to economic disaster would actually lead to $178 trillion of losses by 2070. And that includes physical risks, transitional risks, financial effect of these risks as well. So there's the human life, which is the most important thing. And then there's also so many other risks that would actually change the way we live, the way we do business, and the way also our economy operates. And that's why it's really important that we look at these risks. Is not going to be an individual risk or an organizational risk. It's a global risk that each one of us has actually to address depending on their level of involvement. Opportunity, yes, I agree with those who said it's a risk and opportunity. Also, as per the market research, there is a market, adaptation market alone is a $2 trillion market by 2026. It's a growing market with proven business models and also public capital availability. So you could see some numbers. And then if you look at the local context, which is the UAE context, so you can see that, for example, in August 2023, 6 major UAE banks dedicated $190 billion in green financing projects. So it is a big risk, but at the same time, that risk is now transferred into opportunities, market opportunities. And also, we will look into more how a company can benefit from the net zero movement and give more of specific benefits to organizations alone in a later slide, and I can share that with you as well. So yes, we will be sharing, Suzanne, the presentation, and thank you so much for the great input. whoever has mentioned that this is only a very high level overview of the opportunities and risk. I'm sure that if you just go on Google, Ms. Habiba also had mentioned a few of them at the beginning. And then if you just put it in Google, you would see that there are, I think you could dedicate days of presentations just on climate risks and opportunities. Organizations, companies are not the only ones who are actually seeing that risk. The good thing is that now on a country level, most of the countries have realized that we need to move from just talks regarding climate change and we need to do some action. And a lot of countries have already specified their net zero targets, the day or the year by which they would be achieving net zero. So my question to you is that the UAE is somewhere in this map. Which year is the UAE planning to achieve net zero? I'm assuming that everyone here is in the UAE, but if there's anyone who is not from the UAE, please feel free to share also your country's targets here. I'm talking about the UAE in particular because we are based here. So 2050, if anyone is coming from any different country for joining and dialing in from any different country. So Qasim is from Jordan. Thank you, Qasim, for sharing that, 2060. Any other dialing in from other countries? So I think for the UAE, so the UAE has aggressively set that target. It's an ambitious target. We already understand that. But then we know that we need to align with these targets. And it's not only the UAE, most of the other countries. So it's a global movement on when to achieve net zero. But what is it? What does net zero means? And how do we achieve net zero? So the first step to understand from an organizational level. Now we'll be focusing today on organizational level, although there's some of the measures or many of the measures and the information that we share can be applied also to individuals. So we are going to start with the very basic step, which is calculating your emissions, understanding where these emissions fall. Because if you don't understand, you cannot manage the carbon emissions, you cannot set targets, and you cannot move to actually doing some implementation. So the first step, which is an important step, is the carbon footprint. What is the carbon footprint? Carbon footprint is an estimation of the greenhouse gas emissions that an organization emits through its operational activities over a defined period of time. And it's usually expressed in tons of CO2. So you can hear net zero, it's net zero equivalent of CO2, which is carbon emissions coming from all different GHG or greenhouse gas emissions. Most people don't talk about greenhouse gases a lot because there is a way of actually combining all of these greenhouse gases impacts into a single value of CO2 equivalent, which we will also explain later on. So what would the company benefit? Maybe someone can actually, before I show the answers, maybe someone can share with us if their company has already committed to net zero, maybe they already understand, or they could be leading or driving these carbon or net zero movement within their organization. So if you can share with me in the chat a few reasons of why a company, why is it important for a company to measure their carbon emissions? Do we have anyone who can volunteer to write in the chat to tell us why do they think it's important for their organization to actually measure their carbon emissions? Where do these carbon emissions come from? Okay, so I'm gonna give a few seconds and then, okay, no one is here. So let's say to understand how to reduce them and thus enhance their operations and brand reputation, very nice. To save the energy and environment, measure it so you can manage it. Very well said. Thank you, David. I like that statement always. Measure it so you can manage it. Exactly. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. So whenever we say carbon management, how to manage your carbon, how to manage your energy, how to manage your waste. So the first step is actually to measure those emissions. So as you mentioned, many of you are actually sharing their input. Thank you so much for being an engaged audience. So basically, when you measure your emissions, you identify how much of impact you have, you take action, you reduce your operational cost. Carbon, for those who may not be aware, is an efficiency metric. It's a common denominator between so many resources usage. For example, energy, you have waste, you have fuel use for transportation, etc. Of course, resilience and risk mitigation, access to green funds, improve branding and image, and also aligning to government ambition and also carbon legislations and compliance. So these are some of the reasons. How do you measure it? What do you use to measure it? So there are actually standards and protocols that are used today for calculating or measuring your carbon footprint. The most, I think, famous one is the GHG protocol, which we will be covering in much more in depth and details later on in the slides. And then we have also ISO 14064. SBTI, science-based target, is a relatively new standard that helps in target setting to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And then we have Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, which is basically related to how to disclose your carbon emissions after you calculate them. Now, and my question is, how many of you are coming from organizations that are already using some of these standards or are already calculating their carbon footprint? Maybe if there is a volunteer, they can also share with us their journey on how they calculated their carbon footprint and how much of a challenging or an easy exercise that was. So Accenture has CDP and also SBTI is very nice. So I can see someone coming from very advanced levels. Okay. So I think those companies who started really early in their carbon accounting, they've already reached to the science-based targets and the CDP. A lot of organizations locally and in these regions are still at the very early stages of calculating their carbon footprints. So moving on. How to calculate your carbon footprint. So as I said, we are going to use actually to refer to the GHG protocol throughout this, this presentation, because that's one of the common standards used. So first of all, you need to select your emissions accounting standard. Of course, if you are going to disclose, you need to know also what is the disclosure requirements. If you're following SBTI, you need also to align with SBTI. Then you need to define your emissions boundaries, identify emission sources and collect data, and then you can calculate your emissions, develop your GHG inventory report, and also an inventory management plan. So under the GHG protocol, there are multiple standards. There are multiple standards available depending on the industry. The most commonly used are the GHG protocol corporate standard, and then we have also the corporate value chain, which is focusing mostly on scope 3 accounting and reporting. Important criteria for a GHG accounting, which is a challenge that we see in with a lot of our clients, also with a lot of our partners in the market, is following the key principles. The beauty about GHG protocol is that it defines a very good standard and a framework. But unless you follow these 5 key principles set out in the protocol, it becomes very difficult for you to actually see the progress and also to annually estimate your carbon emissions based on similar criteria. So you need to make sure for your GHG emission, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be complete, it needs to be consistent. For example, if you have used a certain emission factor or a certain activity data in year 1, then in year 2, when you're updating, because usually carbon footprints are calculated annually. So when you update it in year 2, you need to make sure that you are consistent with those factors that you have used a year earlier. Otherwise, you could actually deviate and miscalculate your emissions. It needs to be transparent. So all of the factors, all of the assumptions, exclusions need also to be well documented. And then, of course, it needs to be accurate. And here I would like to highlight one challenge. I'm not sure how many of our audience have already experienced that challenge. It is actually the data collection and the data accuracy. It's really one of the most challenging, one of the most challenging steps of calculating your emissions is to make sure that you follow these principles and you collect accurate data, and also you define a proper framework that can be used for years to come. And I always say the first year is going to be very challenging, but then for years to come, it will be very easy for you to actually follow the same principles that you have established at the initial year or at the base year. So when it comes to emissions, there's also another important factor in calculating emissions, an important concept, which is defining boundaries. What do we mean by boundaries? So there are 2 different types of boundaries. There are organizational boundaries and there are operational boundaries. So for organizational boundaries, we actually look at a company in terms of organizational structure. And there are 2 different approaches that could be used, either the equity share or the control approaches. Equity share looks at how much contribution you have in each of the companies, group of companies, subsidiaries, JVs, mergers, acquisitions. Whereas the control approach look at how much of a control you have on different assets or different facilities, and then you can include only those that are under your control. Operational boundaries, on the other hand, looks at the direct and indirect emissions. Maybe you've heard about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So through the operational boundaries, you would be looking at how do you define scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Does anyone know what scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? If in the chat, if yes or no. Does anyone know what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions in terms of operational boundaries? Yes, okay, Lapa knows. Very nice. Okay, Reem also knows. Okay, then I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Confusing, yes, it is most of the time confusing. Honestly, you're not the only one who's confused because the definitions change. And also depending on what becomes into your control and what's not into your control is something that also changes. So it's actually, even though setting the boundaries is something that we do in base year, but we actually verify and check on an annual basis to make sure that your GHG inventory is complete. So I think we have some of our audience who knows what scope 1, 2, 3, which is very good. So this is actually a very famous image from the GHG protocol that looks at or explains, I would say, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions very nicely. So let's say Farnek, for example, is the reporting company. And so scope 1 is everything related to direct emissions coming from our operations. For example, fuel use for company vehicles, operations within our facilities, etc. And then we have scope 2, indirect emissions, which comes mostly from electricity use, electricity, steam, etc. And then we have scope 3, which includes everything else in the value chain, upstream activities, downstream activities. So previously, a lot of companies were only focusing on scope 1 and 2. And I think those who has done this 10 years ago, they would have just looked at scope 1 and 2, and they said, 3 is not part of our emissions calculations. But today, standards such as the science-based targets actually push for inclusion of scope 3, which is really important because let's think about it. For example, if I'm using the laptop and this laptop would not have been manufactured, would not have been transported to the UAE, would not have been brought to my office, would not have used electricity if I'm not using it, right? So scope 3, even though all of these activities is not something that I can control, but these activities are happening because of something I'm using. So it's really important for organizations to expand on these scopes, scope 1, 2, 3, because that's the only way that we as a global level can achieve the net zero targets. Otherwise, if we're all excluding scope 1 and 2, scope 3 from our emissions, and it's the largest one, then no one is going to be able to have a real net zero transformation. So direct emissions, just I think some people understand what it is. So it's from sources owned or controlled by the reporting company. Indirect is anything that's a consequence of activity of the reporting company. This is the factory. So anything that comes out of the factory is actually direct emissions. And then purchased electricity is scope 2. And then we have, for example, services that are provided to the company would be indirect emissions as scope 3. So I hope this scope 1, 2, 3 is now a little bit more clear. If anyone has questions or if it's not clear, please mention in the chat so I can elaborate more. But this is just a bit of an overview of what we mean by scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, because there's always this distinction between what's direct, what's indirect, and what can be done for each of these scopes. Okay, so I'm assuming since nobody mentioned anything on the chat, that everyone now understands scope 1, 2, 3. Yes? Everyone understands scope 1, 2, 3? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. You save me every time. Thank you so much. That's good. Okay. Please feel free to reach to me just because I'm a bit conscious of the time. And we also have Piyush coming in, so we can actually discuss it later at a later stage to define scope 1, 2, 3 for a specific organization. So once we define those boundaries, so we know exactly what needs to be included, then we identify the different emission sources, we select a base year and a calculation approach. We collect the data and choose the emission factors. We apply calculation tools and then roll up data to a corporate level. So this is basically a very simple, I mean, even though the formula looks very simple, but there's a lot of in-depth data and analysis collection and analysis that needs to go. But in simple terms, you have activity data, you multiply it by emission factor, you get tons of emissions. This is for the various types of greenhouse gases. And then to reach to the equivalent, CO2 equivalent of emissions, we need to multiply those emissions into the global warming potential. I don't want to confuse everyone. So in simple terms, activity data multiplied by emission factor is equal to tons of emissions. Activity data could be, for example, electricity consumption could be an activity data, and then emission factor would be the factor that actually converts that usage of the resource into associated emissions. For example, if you take electricity from a renewable plant, then your emission factor could be 0 because that's actually a renewable energy source. But if you take electricity from the grid, then you will need to follow the grid's emission factor. I don't want to make it too detailed. So for emission factors, these are factors that convert activity data into GHG emissions. They're based on country or region emission factors. They could be used from open source databases, or they could be actually measured on site, depending on the activity itself. And then we have also the international databases and cloud source. So once you reach this level, then you actually need to make the calculations. And there are different ways of making the calculations. Either you create your own Excel-based tool where you try to find the emission factors, the activity data, and you build it. And then the second one is the web-based platform where you could use an already established platform and calculate your emissions. So your actually scope, or let's say your task would be more focused on the data collection, data analysis part, rather than establishing a calculator. Where can we get UAE emission factors? It differs. So the grid emission factor could be from the utility provider. Then we have, for example, refrigerants. It could be from types of refrigerants. There are not many researches or measurements done locally, so we usually depend on international figures as well. So there is actually, the emission factors is one of the most challenging, Sarah. I agree with you. It's one of the challenging activities that needs to be taken in a carbon footprint calculations, but it's something that you need to do in day one and then improve on later on. So it varies. We don't have a single source for emission factors, unfortunately. You will need to find either to try to search current providers, for example, for fuel, if they already has done some measurements, or you could do the measurement yourself, but it's very expensive. Usually companies avoid that. We use estimations based on international, local data if available, if not then international data like the IPCC data, etc. Okay, so one of the, for Farnek, we've been using Excel before, but then we've had now created our own cloud-based tool, which is called Carbon Tech. You can see here the emission factors are already established in the calculator. So all you need to do is actually get the activity data, enter it into the tool, and then the tool helps you do the calculations automatically, which saves a lot of time and also ensure consistency between the years. So that's something we're also doing in-house. So this is how a GHG or a carbon footprint should look like. It should give you a breakdown. I mean, this is only for reference users. It's just a sample. It's not related to any organization. So you have scope 1, 2, 3, and then you also have the monthly data for the different scopes. And usually the GHG inventory report would have these details and also all of the other assumptions, exclusions, etc. So that's it for the carbon footprint. I think if we want to focus on carbon footprint, that's something that it just gives you an overview, a high-level overview of how you can establish a carbon footprint. And once you have that emissions, and once you know where your emissions are coming from, I liked at the beginning someone mentioned that we do our carbon footprint to understand where our emissions are coming from. So if my emissions are coming from electricity use, then I need to work on electricity use reduction. If they're coming from fuel use for transportation, then I need to also look at how do I reduce my fuel use, how do I optimize, how do I eliminate for some of the activities the fuel use, maybe through joint partnership with someone else who's going through that route. So there's so many ways that you could do, or so many measures you could do to reduce carbon emissions once you understand where the emissions are coming from and what's your priority as well. Okay, so I'm just gonna give an overview of once you have your carbon footprint, that's your baseline, that's where you start with. And then once you know where you stand, then you need to understand what is your target you want to achieve and how to reach it. For most of organizations and even on a global level, when we talk about net zero, it's actually going to be a journey. It's not a destination, it's rather a journey, even though we say we're committed to net zero by 2050, but it's a journey, and a journey that requires collaborations, involvement from all parties, not only within the organization, but also external stakeholders. So when we look at the 5 steps for achieving net zero, first of all, you need to commit. Once you calculate your emissions and understand, then you need to commit that you're going to achieve net zero. You need to disclose these emissions, either through the disclosure project or through other disclosure methods in your sustainability report, etc. You need to act to actually reduce your emissions and to reach that net zero. Verify the progress, verify the achievements, verify the accuracy also to avoid greenwashing, and then advocate and help others. And now my question for my audience is, what is your role in this journey? That's the very important question that we need to ask. Each one of us need to ask on a personal level. Is it something based on my involvement in my organization? Am I leading it? Am I actually influencing it? Am I a member of this net zero transformation? And that's the question that I would like to ask all of our audience. What is your role in this journey? Commitment. Okay, so we have Nasif who said commitments. Very nice. Okay, so are you, which part of it are you responsible? Net zero is not an achievement of a single person. It's not an achievement of a single department. It's actually an organizational culture that needs to be built and roles needs to be assigned. So Sarah is responsible for action, Nasif for commitment. We have Bigona, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, reporting, raising awareness, very nice. So I think it's really important to know, Naveed, commit, disclose, and act. So you see, even there are different people who have different responsibilities. I'm sure they're part of a bigger net zero team. And there should be always also a commitment level from the management that goes cascaded down to each and every individual employee and even to suppliers, partners, all the external stakeholders. So thank you for those who shared their role. But I think that's a question, it's an open-ended question for everyone who's here to just reflect on that role. And if you don't have a role yet, then maybe you could actually be the champion in your organization and you can start that movement within your organization. Please feel free to reach to us if you need help in pushing that agenda as well and making it financially and technically sound for everyone. Qasim mentioned analyzing, planning, and doing. Thank you so much. So just briefly, these are the steps. If you disclose, you measure, disclose, and assess your carbon emissions. Act, you need to integrate sustainability into daily business operations. Verify through developing a reporting framework, and then you need to advocate and showcase achievements and support to the overall community. And I think part of advocating with those who are with us today. Also, thank you so much for EEG and Ms. Habiba for being part of the whole advocate community that advocates for net zero within the UAE and the region. So once you're committed, then it's really important to set realistic incremental goals to achieve the net zero. So this is a graph from the science-based target where it shows your base year emissions, and then by 2030 you will have near-term targets for around 42%, and then by 2050 you need to achieve a minimum 90% of your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. We always also recommend that you need to align with a standard, and science-based target is the best standard available today for having actually long-term goals and short-term goals. And then we have also, once you have set initial goals, you know which standard you're following, then you need to have a decarbonization strategy and a roadmap. So by actually setting targets and KPIs, carbon emission intensity is a common target. You need to have roadmap and an action plan, because it would be nice to have a decarbonization strategy and targets, But unless there are actions happening on the floor, then nothing is going to be achieved, honestly. And also you need to have annual carbon emission reduction programs, and also think of carbon offsets projects, because no matter how much you try to reduce, mitigate, then you also need to think of how to offset the remaining carbon emissions. So as I always say, net zero, it's a transformation, and that's why we've even selected the topic for today. So any organization that thinks seriously about achieving net zero, it's not about writing the letter of commitment. It's not about just doing the calculations. It's about working on a plan, do, check, act organizational process that will transform and make sure everyone is involved. It's a continuous process. It involves both internal team. You need to focus on your operational processes and have this part of the culture, the DNA of the organization. You need to involve both all stakeholders and suppliers. You need to also align yourself with the market and policies and what's available in the market. And also you need to think of always innovations and technologies. And I always say, like, innovation is the master of everything. You know, if you have innovation, then without investing, a lot of people talk about investing in carbon. There's so many measures that you could actually take without having very huge investments. It could be very small investments and just innovating in the way you run business, innovating in the way you actually operate. And that's innovation can bring you so many other benefits, not only net zero, but other like cost savings, etc. So just because some people are here to actually know what they need to do to achieve net zero. So here we're bringing some of the carbon reduction measures. I would not say it's measures, more than concepts that needs to be well integrated in the organization and in every business processes. Sourcing, look at where you're sourcing your material. Are these materials recycled? Are you resourcing them locally? Explore innovative, if you're in manufacturing, explore innovative manufacturing processes. If not, in buildings, for example, to reduce your energy consumption and emissions. Consider investing in carbon offset projects, implement energy efficient practices and technologies, transition to renewables. I think most of you know this, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly. Promote circular economy, optimize transportation, collaborate with suppliers and stakeholders, conduct life cycle assessments to identify areas for emission reduction, and invest in research and technology. I'm going to leave you with one final video, which actually talks about, a say that I really like. It's a quote from Albert Einstein, which says, "We cannot solve problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So today, I like when Ms. Habiba mentioned that today we're here. Yes, climate change is a natural phenomenon, but we're here today because of the way we as a human have actually treated the earth, or have taken so many resources. We did not look at climate change as a real threat, but it is a threat today, and we need to innovate. So I'll leave you with this small video that just actually pushes the boundaries and encourage you to innovate and motivate you to do something for carbon. And then I'll leave the floor to Piyush to share our Farnek story.
The decarbonization transition is largely a technology transition. In Europe, we've seen that 70% of the decarbonization can be driven by 15 technologies, or around 4% of Europe's GDP is required every year put into those 15 technologies. That is 15 massive markets that are being created that didn't exist or are being accelerated. It's huge.
I'm an optimist. I'm actually very excited about the technology innovation potential, but we gotta have to now all come together. We gotta have to put the best engineering minds on the planet to tackle some of these challenges. 5, 6, 7 years ago, we didn't think hydrogen was actually a big part of the solution. It is today. We look at what happened to solar and electric vehicle. The cost curves on these technologies has gone down massively.
One of the technologies we probably don't talk enough about as a technology is Mother Nature. Incredible technology to help us in the net zero equation. We're certainly seeing clients come with a lot of focus on carbon, but increasing focus on circularity, on biodiversity, on water, especially in the consumer and retail sectors.
You need to master the capex side of the equation and build cheaper and cheaper and cheaper so costs come down. You need to be able to secure demand with large customers so you can de-risk the investment and get the capital. And you need to build capabilities in the technology areas faster than you've ever done before.
The challenge in my mind is how you manage that transition at scope and scale required to drive capital allocation of something like $5 trillion a year. To pull that off is going to require enormous planning and thoughtfulness and engagement from both the public and the private sector. This all needs to happen at a speed that is unparalleled. We built this economy in 200 years. We're going to have to change it radically from top to bottom over the next 30.
The decarbonization transition is
So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Piyush or Ms. Habiba. I'm not sure who's going to take it. And then Piyush.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mona, for that beautiful explanation and the journey that you took everybody through it, and simplifying the terminologies, the requirements, so sometimes the apprehension is from the unknown. But once the issues are open, dissected step by step, it becomes very doable, very practical, and it gets more buy-in from the participants. I would like to remind everybody as well, on both websites of EEG and Farnek, we have the Carbon Tech, which is a nice, simple app that helps you, you feed it the information, it gives you what is your current carbon footprint, and then you can decide of what you want to do. So I would love to welcome Piyush now to take us through the whole process of how do you calculate and all that. Thank you again, Muna, for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for introducing me. And Ms. Muna was brilliant. She explained it so well. It took me some time to understand it, but the way she explained it, I think she made it so much easier for everyone. So we at Farnek, sustainability is in our DNA. We're the pioneers in facility management industry to take this approach and establish sustainability in our operations. We committed to our net zero target of 2050. We were the first FM company in the region to commit to that target. And we established our baseline in the year 2022. And in that through that process, we have established certain targets that we are going to take. And why it's important is because targets is when you actually progress through those targets. And from the year 2023 to 2026, we are hoping to reduce up to 70% of our sorry, that's so we are aiming to reach our 2050 goal by the year net zero by the year 2050. And so the most important bit to start our net zero journey is to establish our baseline, and that was established in the year 2022. Based on the baseline, we have our scope 1 emission at 42% and our scope 2 emission at 31%. And if you can see on this graph, we have able to segregate our top contributors towards our carbon emission. And based on our segregation of these each contributors, we were able to focus on our areas to be able to reduce these carbon emissions. Now, based on the analysis we have done, we were able to bring forward focal points which we have, which we'll discuss about today. The focus point 1 is the mobile consumption. So if you look into the based on the graph, 40% of our overall consumption of overall carbon emissions coming from our road transport mobile consumptions. And so the prime focus here for Farnek is to address our transportation emissions, and we'll talk about the initiatives we are doing to tackle this in our coming in this year. Yeah, our second focus point is our purchase electricity. So our 32% of our overall emission is from the electricity that we purchase, and based on our emission, we are able to set targets and to reduce our energy consumption, and in turn reflect on our carbon emissions. Then our focus number 3 would be downstream, which is waste generated. Our 12% of overall carbon emission is from the waste generated, and we are committed to implementing waste reduction strategies that would help us in eliminating or reducing this carbon emission. And the upstream stakeholder management is basically all the purchased goods and services is contributing up to 8% of our overall carbon emission, and it is taken as a responsibility by us to collaborate with our suppliers, subcontractors, and partners to implement sustainable practices throughout our supply chain. So mobile combustion, what we are looking at is optimizing a fuel efficiency using a fleet management system. So we use this online tool, which is our own high-tech created smart fleet system. And we use this fleet management system to actively monitor the energy the fuel consumption, streamline the routes, and minimize the idle time. And in turn, we reduce the fuel emissions as well. And what we are looking to do as well is we're looking to collaborate with different routes together, and because we have passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles, so we try to collaborate in a way where we could reduce the routes as well for these vehicles, and also the other thing we are looking at to reduce our mobile consumption is optimizing fuel efficiency by using alternative fuels. So now we're looking into collaborating with different biofuel blends, and that can reduce our consumption at least by 6% of our fuel emissions. And we're also looking into investing into eco-friendly options, which is hybrid vehicles, electrical vehicles, to tackle our road transportation combustion, which we get. The other thing we look into is purchase electricity. Now in purchase electricity, we have we use energy monitoring system. So as we have spoken earlier, that what we cannot monitor, we cannot control, and we cannot find savings. So we implement our own power tech system, and and this system helps us oversee the entire energy consumption across our entire portfolio. And this tool is also helps us look over our energy that's generated through solar energy and a CO2 emission that reflects from this system, from our energy consumption, and helps us segregate these each sources, and based on that we can create energy conservation measures, and that will help us reduce the energy consumption overall. So it is a very data-driven approach, because at the core level of things, we have to look at the data, and based on the data, we have to make judgments on how do we reduce these energy consumptions. Now, we do look into retrofits. We do look into, for example, delamping LED lights. And that only happens when we have the occupancy data with us. That only happens when we have the cooling data, ambient temperature data. All these things that come together is only gives us enough information that helps us make decisions, and that can help us reduce our carbon emissions. And when you look into a complete carbon audit of a facility, carbon footprint of a facility, you're obviously, if it's not an industrial organization, it's if a normal office or different operations, like even for FM industries, 30 to 40% of your energy, of your emissions coming from energy consumption. So when you have to look into reducing or going to a net zero journey, energy consumption and road transportation, these two plays a major role, and they contribute. It's 80-20 rule, like 80% of your consumption will be coming from 20% of your sources. So we have to and that is where the innovation is required the most, and that is where we as well Farnek would be able to help as well, because we have our set of technicians and engineers, and we have 15 years of experience in energy efficiency, and we work very closely on ground with all the technicians, and at a very operational level to a very engineering design based approach. So we are able to tackle this specifically the energy part of it very well through the tools also we have. Like if you implement the Power Tech tool into your organization, we will be able to extract the information. We'll be able to guide you on how you can reduce your energy consumption and in turn get energy savings, as well as reduce your carbon emissions. The other thing we look into is waste generated. So within the tool, which is Power Tech, we can monitor the waste that's generated. And again, it's a very data-driven decision making we do. We give you insights on what material of wastage you are producing. Obviously, this would be integrated with the vendors who will be collecting your data, collecting your wastage, and using the data which we receive from them, we will be giving you insights on how you can recycle these products and what kind of carbon emissions you can remove by recycling or reusing your wastage. So again, emission tracking is very important if you're looking to reach a target, a net zero approach towards your organization. And another thing we use is in Farnek village, we have implemented composting food waste. We compost food wastage. So we have a composting system in Farnek village that is composting 73 tons of staff food a year. And the process significantly curbs around 400 kgs of food wastage, 400 kgs of CO2 emissions and 200 kg of food waste every day. Another thing we have been doing from past 2 years is we are collaborating with our supply chain, and we promote the culture of sustainability within our supply chain. We award the suppliers who have a similar approach as us, and acknowledge their sustainability initiatives. Encourage the suppliers to adopt energy efficiency and low carbon processes, and we collaborate we open to new technologies to collaborate as well in our procurement process. So this is where we are able to tackle these 4 major contributors to our energy to our carbon emission. And overall, at the end of it, we need a dashboard to monitor all our carbon emissions. So everything, if you look into our energy consumption, our wastage, our fuel consumption, all of that has to be driven from one platform so that we can monitor the overall emission that we as an organization is creating, and how we can strategize to reduce that carbon emission and focus on each areas, and probably implement a a carbon reduction measure and see the difference using that and how it is reflecting on. So we do it monthly. We watch our trend monthly on how we are approaching our targets, and what we believe is through that we can achieve our targets. If you're not monitoring, and we come at the end of the year, and then we realize, and then we do our footprint assessment, and when we realize that we have not really achieved our target, and this is how we will not be able to, if you are committed to SBTi standards, we need something that takes us through the journey. Yeah, that's it from me. I will open for you all to ask questions. And
thank you very much, Piyush, for sharing with us the experience and of operations of Farnek itself as a case study to enable participants to understand clearly the processes and steps that need to be taken. So I know there will be a lot of questions now. I would appreciate that the questions are being put on the chat to enable us to get the speakers to answer them. Muna, I know one of the questions that I always get is, where do we draw the line? Scope 3 is everything under the sky, but really, is it fair on the corporations to be tackling? How should they identify what will be? It's really like sustainability reporting. You have to understand what are the material issues, and then you focus on them. With regards to Scope 3, it must be a guideline or something to tell them, focus on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you share with us some of those?
Sure. So I always look at it. I mean, I like the fact that you mentioned about sustainability reporting, and there's like material issues that needs to be identified. I think a similar approach needs to be, even though there is a movement today that each company is responsible for all of their Scope 3 emissions, but I agree with you, that's not something that a company at a very early stage can do. So it's always about prioritization. First of all, understanding a lot of the data related to some of your Scope 3 emissions is data that it might take 10 years for you to actually collect. So instead of saying, I will be waiting 10 years and then decide on what to do for them, it's just a matter of prioritization, focusing on what is in your control, which is Scope 1 and Scope 2 has to be the top priority. And then when we look at Scope 3, which of these Scope 3 emissions are very much, let's say, you can directly influence, are very relevant to your business. One example, for example, Farnek, now when Piyush mentioned, waste for us is Scope 3, because even though we generate within the facility, we send it to an outside treatment facilities like DM or recycling plants, etc. But we know waste is coming directly from our operations. So if we actually adopt a circular economy concept in our day-to-day, in our purchasing decisions, in our operational processes, then we can directly influence, change, reduce our waste emissions, and as well as our carbon emissions. So it's all about how do you prioritize. I always like to start with an assessment. You look at your 15 categories in your GHG protocol, and then give them a score based on relevance, a score based on significance, and also a score based on your control or influence for this activity or this emission source. And then based on the overall score, you can actually say that year 1 to year 5, I'll be focusing on my top 5 categories. Year 5 to year 10, I'll be focusing on my second. Because also there is a level of understanding in the market that's not there. If your supplier doesn't understand, if your end user doesn't understand, then how will you be able to influence these decisions? So have initiatives, have it in place, don't ignore it totally, but depending on the company's maturity level in terms of carbon emission accounting and also reduction plans, and in terms of availability of data, in terms of market understanding and readiness, I think it has to be part of the roadmap. It's not something that a company can say, I'm going to do all 15 Scope 3. No, it doesn't work this way. It's just about prioritization, knowing where you stand, knowing which are actually the most significant, relevant ones that you can influence. Start with them, start small, start with 1, 2, 3 categories, and then move into the next 15 ones.
Thank you very much, Mona. That was very helpful. Really, judging from the interest that we saw today with the attendees, although it was short notice, mashallah, we got this number of attendees, and my message is to Marcos, then I am committed that this will not be a one-off. We will definitely should be looking at it, at least doing it biannually, if not more. And this is part of our responsibility, and this is part of our mandate at Emirates Environmental Group, is raising awareness, is advocacy, and I think this kind of platforms really are very effective in disseminating the right type of knowledge, in understanding what is the current scenario on the ground here in the UAE to enable our players as well as in the region on taking the corrective actions. I would like to take you really, Muna, Piyush, you are showing us the amount of waste on a daily, food waste that was, you are dealing with it, 200 kilos on a daily basis. If you take that on an annual basis and you are seeing how many kilos you are diverting from the landfill, actually, that is again another very important step and very important calculation that you need to add it in there. And what does that translate in CO2 emission reduction? So, you know, it's a continuous, it's a beautiful continuous journey. Once you take one step, you will see that it opens up another avenue, another, and it connects with all your other operations. To understand, I agree with you completely, for the organization to understand where is their impact, you know, and is this 200 kilos from your own accommodations and that, or it is from the facilities that you are managing? Again, this is an issue. So you are entering into your stakeholders, you are entering into your third line suppliers. So again, you know, you are connecting so many dots. And it needs to be starting from that champion who has the courage to start it and to bring it. One of the points that I would like to highlight here is UAE has always set a beautiful example that entities want to do it right because they want to have the right image in the country, they want to have the right reputation, they want to do right by the society and the environment. So that willingness to want to do it rightly is one of the main drivers of entities wanting to go into this kind of processes without really the imposing of the laws yet. So wanting to do it, even if there is no law that stipulates them to do it, speaks volume. And this is where you achieve the better results, that you are doing it at your own time, at your own pace, with your own, before it becomes a mandatory requirement. And then you will be, you know, running fast, and you will have to invest so much money to do that. So this is where the message is start doing it now. Put your house in order, see what are the areas that you need to address, focus on those step by step, keep on continuously improving. I have another question as well that I wanted to ask Piyush. You know, you shared with us the Farnek narrative, you know, and I'm sure while you are dealing with so many entities and your reach on the national level as well as on the regional level, because you have markets outside of the UAE, I would like you to give me best practices really from the region of entities that are actually doing it, and what was the substantial progress that they have made, what were the results that they have achieved, and what inspired them, encouraged them to continue this journey. If you can share with us what are the main enablers for that and the best practices, please.
Okay, ma'am. The best practices which I have seen across the board, which companies have been taking, one of the thing is renewable energy. A lot of companies are moving towards renewable energy, and that itself affects your carbon emissions on your from your purchased electricity. And then these companies are also looking into electrical vehicle market has grown exponentially in past 2 years, and it is also coming into commercial vehicles, being electrical vehicles that will impact it majorly, having trucks, having buses, being electrical vehicles, that is something which will also impact the road and transport, carbon emissions through that. Then we have energy services industry, which is working parallelly in terms of retrofitting. So you have the government of UAE itself is looking into reducing the retrofitting the buildings, existing buildings. So that is where you are reducing your at least energy consumption by 20 to 30% by changing your lights. That's something, again, as Ms. Muna said, scope 1 and scope 2 is in your control. Scope 3 is still something which you have to work with your stakeholders, but scope 1 and scope 2 is directly under your control. So electricity is purchased and consumed within the facility. So if you are able to change your lighting, if you to make sure it's the most energy efficient lighting system that is available in the market, your air conditioning, because in UAE again the air conditioning is one of the major contributors towards towards the energy and carbon emission. So if you are tackling this problem, you have to look into implementing the most energy efficient air conditioning practices in your facility. So if the commissioning is not done right, making sure that it's decommissioned, having new systems in place if the systems have reached their life cycle. So these are a few things. Again, we have to, every industry has its own best practices also to look into. So if you're looking into printing industry, they have their own best practices. If you're looking into a telecom industry, they have their own best practices. You're working with one of the two biggest organizations. One of them is a telecom company. We are helping them, reduce the, helping them in the net zero journey, and we are assigning the decarbonization targets for them. So we are also, exposing ourselves to what, in this process of reaching net zero by 2050, what new technologies, what new criteria we have to look into to be able to reach that. So if there's a company who wants to, investigate and be on this journey, we would be happy to help them. And, I would drop in my message, my email address and my mobile number here. I'm happy to take their calls, and, we'll work out together and find the best practices for that particular, industry and the business.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Mr. Qasim from Jordan. It says major challenges in hospitality industry is the guest attitude. Due to lack of awareness regarding the issues and hotel standards, how can we overcome this challenge and how can we address it? The question is to both of you. Who can answer?
So actually, I'm not sure, Mr. Qasim, if you're aware, but Farnek has been working with hospitality within the hospitality sector for the last 40 years, and we've been the Green Globe certifying also hotels for Green Globe for the last 10 plus years. So we understand your pain. That's the first statement I should say. We know hotel industry is not an easy industry to tackle when it comes to sustainability. But the beauty of it is that we have seen trends changing. So, for example, here in the UAE, now we have the Dubai Sustainable Tourism Stamp. So there's even movement from the country level to actually move hotels into a more sustainable businesses. One thing, there's a recent research. I agree with you that maybe this has been the way customers were before, but today there is a much better understanding and awareness. So there's a research done by Booking.com. It says that 75% of actually tourism visitors who would actually prefer an eco-friendly friendly destination or hotel. So I think that would be there. There will be different levels of people who you deal with, and that awareness, understanding is changing, but it's something that needs to be tackled. But it should not be a barrier. That would be my recommendation for anyone, because any industry has its own challenges. It should not be a barrier because there are so many other things that you could manage internally through your own operations before looking at the customers. I'll give an example always of energy. So many times you would see that the customer, maybe I've been into hotels where it's too cold. I was calling them and telling them it's too cold, please change the temperature. But there are problems with the BMS, or there are problems with the actual design of the building, or the operation system the operation team does not understand that there are optimum levels of running the hotel. So always look at what you can do internally. The guest area is always going to be a challenge area, not only for carbon, but for service level. We're talking here about 5-star, service where customers really expect the best service from all levels. But then there's so much that can be done in terms of how you manage the waste that comes out of the rooms, in terms of how you manage the energy, water use, etc. for these customers based on systems that you control. You're controlling the BMS, you're controlling the chiller. If the chiller that you're using is 20 years plus old, then definitely it would be a major consumer of your energy. If you are sourcing your products from very far areas, then that's basically you're actually increasing your upstream emissions. So there's so many decisions that can be taken in the hotel from the actually creating that culture within all the hotel functions: procurement, management, administration, operations, everyone who's there. Let's first focus on what's in our control and keep the guest area as something that needs to be improved. Focus a lot on awareness, which is a good thing now. Also, these like Green Globe and other standards, they focus also on customer awareness and hotel visitors awareness. And I think bit by bit, we can build that kind of, economy that where everyone understands what sustainability is. But the good news is the trend is changing. People are understanding it better. So it's not as challenging as it used to be 10 years ago. That's for sure.
Thank you very much, Muna. And I would like to add, Qasim, that making a film, and putting it in the rooms, like the welcoming note, when they enter into the room, they see that film talks about sustainability, how sustainable the hotel is, what are the steps that are being taken, and taking the customers, the clients, from there, they speak. It's not only the hotel staff, it is actually guests as well who speak about the things that they have seen, that they have liked. That will encourage and inspire others to follow. Human nature, you follow. So when they see that there are good practices already in place and there are other guests who are talking about it and praising and singing the praises of the hotels, they will be bound to respect that and follow that. We deal with many hotels as well, Muna, in the UAE. And mashallah, we are seeing a lot of work that is being done with regards, as you mentioned, about energy conservation, about changing up, retrofitting, even with the new hotels. It's a given now. The hotels are going the way they are building it. It's that these are green hotels. They are certified, LEED or others. But for the challenges are with the ones that are already there. And entities are prepared today to invest in retrofitting their hotels to be more sustainable, to be more resilient, to be able to the challenges that are facing them with different aspects of water consumption, of energy consumption, of the efficiency of their systems in place. Particularly whatever you mentioned, Muna, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges that all the hotels face because of the centralization of the cooling system. So they will tell you that we are forced to put it on this number because the eastern part of the hotel is facing the sun, and so it is very hot. But really, the people that are on the west side of the hotel or north side of the hotel are shivering because they are not really getting that amount. So now decentralization of this, making it into small units that can feed, and the switches that deal with different areas of the hotel at the different times has helped deal with that and cover that gap. But the journey continues and there's still a lot of scope of improvement in this. You are not the only one, Qasim, facing this challenge. It's everywhere. Even in the most advanced part of the world. So we need to be always creative and innovative in how we address these challenges that are facing us. Muna, there's another question that I would like to ask from one of the participants. She's asking, her name is Iman Al-Sharif, what is the mechanism you have for recycling companies like us when we are recycling more than 2,000 tons of end-of-life material, which substitute primary material? She said that we know we are reducing 2 million tons of carbon emissions annually, but we have no means of measuring. How can we measure our carbon reduction, and can we get credit for it? Very good question, Iman. I hope, Muna, you will be able to address that.
So actually, when it comes to entities that are into reducing not only their carbon emissions, but they're working on decarbonization solutions in general. So one way is to actually register that as carbon credits and then use that to offset other areas as well. So we need to look more into the details of how you manage the whole process. How do you actually, what is also the resources you use, what's the emissions that you generate as part of the treatment process, because there's also emissions related to treating that waste or recycling that waste. So we need to look into the details to understand how much of the offsets are needed to actually cover the emissions that are generated within the facility, and how much is extra that could be used for offsetting or for being registered as carbon credits and maybe used in carbon trading. So we would need to go into the details to understand more. I agree with you that the mechanisms are not, because it's not something that's just standard where everyone can actually go and look into it. We need to analyze. We do a feasibility usually for such projects, and then we determine how much of it can be used as for carbon credits and how much of it need to be utilized for internal usage as well. So that's something we could take offline. Please feel free to send me an email, or Piyush, maybe Piyush, if you can add our details as well. We'll be more than happy to take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much. Muna, I have one question.
Yes.
In dealing with the different sectors and in your wide spectrum of clientele, which sectors or industries you see are facing the unique challenges in their decarbonization?
Manufacturing.
Yes.
I would always say manufacturing. Because when it comes to even the standards deal with, like, for example, cement, aluminum, tire. So because for buildings, it's relatively easy, they're not that complex. When it comes to manufacturing, you can actually reduce as much as you can. There's also, for example, oil extraction. So the industries in general, let's say commercial is easy, but when it comes to industries, whether it's oil industry or it's any other manufacturing, for example, or processing, I say like aluminum, cement, etc. Because it actually, these kind of the solutions have to be tailored. Plus, most of these industries are energy intense, carbon intense processes. So for them, the gap is much bigger between where they stand and where they need to be. A lot of them are using conventional systems. There's conventional design. They inherited so much legacy that they need to deal with. So I would say if you are only having buildings, then your life is much easier. But if you're in industries, I'm not going to push, because there's so many industries that are doing really, really well. And there's so many pioneers, like, for example, Michelin, the tire manufacturing. Here we have Dubal, Emirates Global Aluminum. There are aluminum, but they're already doing a lot. So it should not be a major obstacle, but they are faced with extreme challenges compared to other, let's say, not industry intense operations, like normal commercial buildings operations, etc. That are much easier. That would be my personal opinion. I'm not sure if there's anyone here from industries as well, or someone who could actually challenge what I've just mentioned. I'm free to discuss as well, because we're all learning, we're all growing together. And I mean, you mentioned this earlier, net zero, decarbonization. No one has achieved net zero yet. No organization has achieved net zero yet. So it's something where we need actually to innovate, to be creative, and also to be open, that we don't know everything. We're learning, we're growing, the industry is learning, technology is coming into the picture, innovations are required, and step by step that knowledge would be built, and hopefully I can give you a very solid answer based on research and data in the next 2 to 3 years, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Muna. I don't see any more. There's only one more question I see in the chat is, how are organizations managing hybrid work patterns in this mix? Is it clear for you?
Hybrid work pattern. Hybrid work pattern.
How does hybrid, sorry, what can you
Hybrid work pattern.
Mm-hmm.
The organizations are maintaining hybrid work pattern.
Of course, they save a lot on the employees commuting. So definitely, if you could look at carbon emissions before the hybrid mode starts and collect the data of all the people, where they're coming, what vehicles they're using, and then you start the hybrid mode or the hybrid program, hybrid work program, and then again do a calculation in a later year or after a few months, then you would definitely see a decline. Yes, I'm a big promoter of hybrid work because it does save a lot on the environmental part as well. A lot of times it also improves in productivity, but it all depends on what kind of business is the business actually benefiting from it or not, and at the same time, how much flexibility is allowed. But yes, it will be definitely translated into carbon emissions reduction for sure.
The occupancy reduces overall, right? So the occupancy is less, then you will have less emissions overall.
And that's also additional. So employee commute and also energy use for the building. I agree with you.
Thank you very much, really, for a beautiful and very productive session. And I'm definitely for it that we continue this beautiful, informative discussions and sessions. Let's plan. And another thing that I would like to suggest now that our members are with us and a lot of interested and followers is that we put useful tips at least once a week. We put useful tips for our audience, to enable them to ease that apprehension, to encourage them to take the first step, to inspire them to continue, to understand issues that are very technical and very difficult at times. So inshallah, there's a lot that can be done. We are always only a phone call away or an email away. Communicate with us, reach us, and let us continue building this effective partnership, join this wonderful platform, and let us have a beautiful and strong and positive impact on the ground in our country and in the whole region and globally as well. I sincerely thank you, Muna, for your wonderful explanation, wealth of information that you shared with us. There was a lot of knowledge that will be digested today by the participants. Thank you very much, Piyush, for taking them through the steps and what you have done at your organization. And that was really giving participants a clear example of where to start and how to start. Many a times, entities will tell you, we don't know where to start from. For sharing with them those steps was very effective. Thank you very much. And I would say a very good morning to everybody, and inshallah we meet soon.
And many thanks for the great audience who's made this successful. Thank you so much to everyone. And thank you, Ms. Habiba, for the great moderation. We really appreciate it and looking forward to much more to come, inshallah.
Inshallah, definitely.
Thank you.